They tell you to be kind, to be helpful, to stay agreeable, as if that alone will earn you loyalty, recognition, or peace. But no one tells you what happens when that kindness becomes your only identity. You start saying yes before you even think, staying quiet when your values are being insulted, smiling through frustration just to avoid conflict. And slowly, without even noticing, you begin to disappear. You're not being respected, you're being used. The more you give without boundaries, the more they expect, not because they're cruel, but because you've trained them to. That's the cost of being the so-called good guy. It's not goodness, it's self-erasure. But here's the shift. This isn't about becoming bitter or hard. It's about becoming rooted. Stoic masculinity teaches you to stop trading self-respect for comfort and to stop confusing approval with virtue. In this video, we'll explore why trying to be liked keeps you invisible, how emotional self-respect begins with saying no without guilt, and what it takes to build quiet confidence that doesn't beg to be noticed. You're not alone if you feel tired, overlooked, or misunderstood. Many strong men have felt the same. But this can be your turning point. So stay with me, because once you understand the cost of being agreeable, you'll never look at respect the same way again. And when you're ready, share your story below. You never know who needs to hear it. 1. Being liked is not the same as being respected. Everyone likes the guy who's easy to be around. The one who listens more than he speaks, who nods even when he disagrees, who smooths over tension with a quiet joke or a polite silence. He's the dependable one, the one who stays late without being asked, the one who shows up when others don't. But here's the painful truth. Liking doesn't equal respect. And if you're not careful, you'll trade one for the illusion of the other. You'll become the man who's always invited but never heard, the man who's appreciated in words but not in decisions. And that difference, subtle as it may seem, is the dividing line between presence and utility, between being a person and being a placeholder. Respect is weight. It's what makes people think twice before they interrupt you, before they take your time, before they make choices that affect your life without asking. And you don't earn that kind of weight by being agreeable. You earn it by being anchored in your values, in your time, in your voice. When you're constantly bending to be liked, you're teaching the world that your shape is negotiable. And people don't respect what's always shifting. They respect what holds. You might be the favorite in the office, the friend everyone calls to vent, the one they describe as so nice and always there. But when it comes time for something real, leadership, truth, confrontation, change, they often turn to someone else. Not because that person is better, but because they're firmer, clearer, willing to be misunderstood in the name of staying honest. There's a kind of invisible fatigue that sets in when you live to be liked. It creeps in during those moments when you agree to things that drain you, when you smile in rooms that shrink your spirit, when you walk away from conversations wondering why your voice never made it to the surface. And you carry that fatigue like it's just part of being a good person. But that's not goodness. That's quiet erasure. It's self-abandonment dressed as politeness. And over time, it teaches people and yourself that your needs are optional, that your time is negotiable, that your presence is assumed, not appreciated. In a Stoic framework, this is the kind of life that leads to internal conflict. Because the Stoic doesn't chase applause. He doesn't yield just to keep things comfortable. He doesn't sacrifice his clarity to win approval. Instead, he stands, not stubbornly, not arrogantly, but unshakably. A Stoic understands that being respected means living in alignment with your principles, even when that alignment costs you ease, warmth, or popularity. Marcus Aurelius never ruled by being liked. He ruled by being rooted in what was just, in what was necessary, in what was reasonable. And he didn't explain himself at every turn. He acted in accordance with his values, and let that be enough. That's the shift this idea demands. It's not about becoming cold or distant. It's about choosing presence over performance. It's about deciding that you'd rather be trusted than liked, that you'd rather be remembered for your clarity than your compliance. In practice, this means you stop speaking just to soothe. You stop saying yes when your soul says no. You stop showing up as the easy one and start showing up as the honest one. It means allowing some discomfort, letting others deal with your no without softening it with guilt or apology. Because the more you soften your edges to fit the room, the less the room ever has to meet you where you truly are. Respect grows in the spaces where you draw lines, where you let silence hold instead of rushing in to rescue awkwardness, where you share your opinion, not to dominate, but to contribute something grounded, where your kindness isn't about compliance, but about choice. You're not good because you're always available. You're good because you know when to give and when to protect what you've built. And what you've built is valuable. Your energy, your clarity, your sense of direction. These things should not be on the table every time someone wants something from you. And yes, stepping into this mindset will shake things up. People who relied on your silence will feel challenged by your voice. People who praised your flexibility may resent your firmness. That's natural. That's part of the recalibration. Because people don't just have to get used to what you're becoming. They have to unlearn what they assumed you'd always be. But let that discomfort unfold. Don't rescue them from it. Because the man who's always rescuing others from discomfort usually has none of his own space left to stand in. Being liked is easy. Say yes enough, and most people will keep you around. But being respected, that's earned, quietly, consistently. Not through volume, but through clarity. Through the courage to say less, but mean every word. Through the ability to remain still when pressured and firm when challenged. Through the wisdom to know that if being liked means disappearing, it's not worth it. Respect may not come with applause, but it comes with gravity. And when you carry yourself with gravity, the world shifts. Not because you demand it to, but because it can't help but respond to a man who finally stopped asking for permission to exist. 2. People don't respect what you don't protect. People will always test the edges of what you allow. Not because they're cruel, but because that's what people do. They respond to boundaries, or the lack of them. When you don't draw the line, they assume there isn't one. And once that pattern is set, you're not just giving them permission, you're training them. If you stay late every time without complaint, they stop seeing it as an effort and start seeing it as expected. If you let someone speak over you again and again, they stop realizing you have something to say. If you don't protect your peace, your time, or your energy, don't be shocked when no one else does either. Respect doesn't start with them. It starts with you. This is where many good men get stuck. You don't want to seem difficult. You don't want to be the guy who always says no. So you make small compromises thinking you're being flexible. But the truth is, every time you tolerate something that bothers you, lateness, dismissiveness, emotional dumping, crossed boundaries, you teach the world that this is acceptable. Not once, but every time. And eventually, what was once an exception becomes the rule. You're left carrying the weight of interactions that feel one-sided, conversations that drain you, responsibilities you never agreed to but somehow became yours. The resentment builds, quietly, privately, until one day, you realize people don't take you seriously, not because they're unkind, but because you never gave them a reason to. There's a hard truth here. Being liked often means being available. Being respected means being selective. The difference lies in what you're willing to protect. If your time is always open, it holds no value. If your boundaries are always negotiable, they lose meaning. People respect what has consequences, and you can't be a man of consequence if you allow yourself to be used, delayed, ignored, or overwritten without response. You don't need to react loudly, but you do need to hold firm. The Stoic man doesn't yell, he doesn't chase validation, he simply stands, not to resist others, but to remain true to himself. There was a time when I allowed a client to delay payment after payment because I didn't want to disrupt the relationship. I thought being patient showed strength. I thought it proved my integrity. But all it proved was that I lacked a line. They liked me, yes, polite, accommodating, a pleasure to work with. But when deadlines mattered, when the money was on the table, they respected the man who came after me, the one who said no, the one who didn't over-explain, the one who didn't smile through missed invoices. That man wasn't more skilled. He was simply more defined. And that definition is what drew respect. In your own life, look at where things feel heavy. Where do you feel invisible? Where do you feel taken for granted? In most cases, the pain doesn't come from one event. It comes from patterns. Patterns you participated in by staying silent, staying nice, staying agreeable when what was needed was firmness. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you unaware of the signal your silence sends. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You begin to understand that your peace is not owed to anyone else. Your energy is not a gift to be handed out endlessly. That your time, your focus, your attention, these are sacred. And if you don't treat them that way, no one else will. Stoicism calls for alignment with nature and reason. It doesn't ask you to fight every battle. It asks you to act with clarity, to choose what to respond to set boundaries not from ego, but from wisdom. If something costs you your peace every time, it's not noble to endure it. It's reckless. Self-sacrifice without discernment isn't a virtue. It's self-neglect. And no one respects the man who neglects himself in order to be accepted. Because once acceptance becomes your goal, you'll never draw a line strong enough to protect what truly matters. This shift doesn't mean cutting people off. It means being clear about what you'll no longer participate in. It means letting someone know, without anger, that your time matters, that your silence has purpose, that your kindness has limits. Some people will adjust, some will resist. That's not your responsibility. Your only task is to stop betraying yourself to keep others comfortable. Because when you do, you no longer live by your own standard, you live by their expectations. The man who commands respect doesn't need to demand it. He becomes it through his consistency, his clarity, and his presence. He doesn't get pulled into every mess. He doesn't explain every decision. He moves with intention. He listens without absorbing. And when something violates his standard, he responds with simplicity. A no, a boundary, a pause, a decision. Not everything deserves access to your energy. Not everyone deserves a seat at your table. And if you don't make that clear, they'll assume they belong. Until you burn out and blame them. When the truth is, you never protected what needed protecting. You don't owe the world your constant availability. You owe yourself protection. Not through walls, but through grounded decisions. Not through anger, but through alignment. Your life is not a service, it's a responsibility. And when you start treating it that way, you stop waiting for others to respect you, because you already do. 3. The good guy syndrome is rooted in fear, not strength. It doesn't always start with weakness. Sometimes it starts with pride. You want to be dependable. You want to be the calm one, the steady one, the man who never makes waves. So you nod even when you disagree. You forgive before apologies come. You carry more than your share, not because anyone asked you to, but because being the good guy has become your identity. But if you look closer, under all that politeness and patience, you'll find something else driving your behavior. Fear, not virtue. No clarity. Fear. Fear of conflict. Fear of rejection. Fear of being seen as difficult or selfish or unkind. You act like you're avoiding tension for the sake of others, but deep down it's because you don't want to deal with what might happen if you finally speak up. So you stay silent when someone disrespects you. You go along with decisions you don't agree with. You play small to make others feel big, and then you wonder why your needs are ignored, your voice unheard, your limits tested. It's because the image you've worked so hard to maintain, the good guy, is rooted in avoidance, not alignment. I saw this play out in my own life more than once. There was a friendship that should have ended years earlier. It was draining, one-sided, and built entirely on guilt and obligation. But I stayed. Not because I believed in the connection, but because I was afraid of what ending it might look like, the discomfort, the judgment, the story they might tell about me afterward. I convinced myself I was being mature, loyal, and patient. The truth, I was being passive, afraid, waiting for someone else to draw the line I should have drawn years ago. When I finally stepped away, it wasn't explosive, it was quiet. And afterward I realized something important. The peace I was trying to protect had never existed in the first place. That's how the good guy syndrome works. It rewards you with surface-level harmony, but robs you of real connection. Because you're not showing up honestly. You're showing up filtered, edited down to whatever version seems easiest to digest. But authenticity is never soft around the edges. It takes courage to show who you are and what you need. Stoicism isn't about detachment or suppression. It's about discipline, inner order, and alignment with truth. And truth requires confrontation, not always with others, but with yourself. Marcus Aurelius didn't write, "Be nice and avoid upsetting people." He wrote, "If it's not right, don't do it. If it's not true, don't say it." That isn't passive, that's active clarity. That's integrity under pressure. Being kind is good. Being respectful is essential. But being so agreeable that you lose yourself isn't virtuous. It's self-erasure. And no one respects a man who constantly erases himself to stay liked. People respect those who are consistent with their principles, not those who disappear behind politeness. I grew up admiring my father's calm. He never raised his voice, never got into arguments, never told anyone no. I thought that made him strong. Later, I saw what it cost him. He was exhausted, overlooked, and quietly resentful. He was praised for being easy to work with by people who took advantage of that ease. He avoided confrontation not because he was grounded, but because he feared what would happen if he ever let his frustration show. His silence wasn't peace, it was pressure with no release. And by the time he realized it, his sense of self had been chipped away piece by piece. When you live to avoid discomfort, you start folding before anyone even presses. You anticipate needs that aren't yours to carry. You apologize before anyone takes offense. You offer more than is asked, hoping that generosity will shield you from conflict. But that's not a strength. That's fear wrapped in politeness. That's emotional control handed over in the name of being perceived as good. And the problem is, it works. For a while, you get approval, you get applause, but you don't get respect. Because respect is only given to men who carry edges. And edges don't come from fear, they come from self-respect. The Stoic path is not about becoming distant, it's about becoming real. It's about speaking truth without drama, saying no without guilt, and leaving spaces where your integrity is at risk. It's about learning that fear, especially fear of not being liked, is the enemy of peace, not the path to it. You can't claim peace when you're constantly sacrificing your truth to keep others calm. That isn't peace, it's quiet desperation. So you need to ask yourself, are you kind or are you afraid? Are you calm or are you numb? Are you being patient or are you avoiding? The answers to those questions determine whether your identity is grounded in strength or built on the sand of others' approval. And when you answer honestly, even if it hurts, you start to reclaim something powerful. Your will, your prohairesis as the Stoics called it, your inner authority. That part of you that decides, not based on fear, but on values. Real strength doesn't avoid the hard moments. It walks into them with quiet conviction. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is say, this no longer works for me. Without anger, without apology, just presence. Because a man who's done pleasing knows he doesn't need to be understood. He needs to be true. And the more true you become, the less permission you'll seek, and the more respect you'll command. Not through force, but through quiet, unshakable clarity. 4. Nice men finish last because they never say no. There's a quiet kind of suffering that comes from always saying yes. It wears a smile, it shows up early, it stays late, it makes things easier for everyone except the one living it. On the surface, it looks like generosity, dependability, and kindness. But underneath, it's exhaustion. Not from doing too much, but from never knowing when or how to say no. And the truth is, if you never draw a line, people will treat you like you don't have one. They won't ask if you're okay. They'll assume you are. You've trained them to. You've said yes to the extra work, the favor, the last-minute change of plans, the emotional labor. Not because you had the energy, but because you didn't want to disappoint. Because you didn't want to be misunderstood. Because being seen as nice felt safer than being seen as assertive. But here's the cost. The more you say yes to what depletes you, the more invisible you become. Not out of malice, but out of familiarity. You become the man they rely on, not the man they respect. And that's the catch. Saying yes makes you agreeable, but it doesn't make you valuable. It makes you available, and often forgettable. Because without boundaries, your kindness becomes currency that others spend for free. It's not that they're using you, it's that you've never made the cost visible. You've never let your no shape your yes. And without contrast, even your generosity becomes expected, routine, taken for granted. That's not virtue, that's surrender. I've watched good men burn out not from weakness, but from the belief that saying no is a failure of character. that turning down a request makes them selfish, declining an invitation makes them rude. So they keep giving, and the world keeps asking, until one day something small, a text, a tone, a request, breaks them. Not because it was too much, but because it was one too many. And when they finally say enough, the world doesn't understand, because it never saw the buildup, only the breakdown. Stoic philosophy doesn't reward this kind of erosion. It doesn't praise the man who dissolves into everyone else's comfort. It respects the man who holds his shape, who acts with intention, who knows that saying no is not rejection, it's direction. Marcus Aurelius didn't govern by pleasing the crowd. He governed by principle. Epictetus didn't teach us to yield endlessly. He taught us to choose wisely. And choosing wisely means knowing what to decline, not just what to accept. You don't need to become harsh. You don't need to withdraw. But you do need to become selective, because your time is limited. Your energy is finite. Your focus is sacred. Every yes costs something. And if you don't know what it's costing, you'll wake up one day bankrupt, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Not because life is cruel, but because you never learned how to keep what's yours. The man who finishes last isn't the one who lacked skill. It's the one who lacked limits. The one who confused service with self-worth. Who believed that being available meant being needed. But real value doesn't come from access. It comes from presence. And presence requires protection. If you don't protect your space, your mind, your peace, you'll give it away in pieces, one quiet yes at a time. Think about the last time you said yes when everything in you wanted to say no. Maybe it was a project you didn't have time for, a conversation you didn't want to have, a commitment you knew you couldn't sustain. And afterward, you felt it, that subtle resentment, that drain, that sense of being just a little less whole than before. That moment wasn't about the other person. It was about you. About your fear of being misunderstood, about your addiction to approval, about your habit of disappearing to keep the peace. But peace bought through self-erasure isn't peace, it's paralysis. It keeps you still, but not steady. It keeps things quiet, but not calm. And it turns your kindness into a trap, something you use to survive, not something you give freely from strength. That's why the nicest men so often carry the heaviest silence, because deep down, they know something is wrong. But they've built their entire identity around never saying it. So let this be your shift. Not into bitterness, but into balance. Not into defiance, but into dignity. Begin with small boundaries, a pause before you answer, a breath before you agree, a question you ask yourself silently, do I really want this, or do I just fear the consequence of refusing? That's where the turning begins. That's where your no becomes a shield, not a sword, a way to honor your time, not punish theirs, a way to step forward, not pull away. Because in the end, saying no isn't about others. It's about you. It's about choosing clarity over confusion, depth over approval, alignment over acceptance. The man who says no when it matters isn't cruel. He's awake. He's present. He's living by design, not by default. And that kind of man doesn't finish last. He just finishes differently. Quieter, calmer, and far more respected. 5. Self-sacrifice without limits leads to silent resentment. It always starts with good intentions. You step in when others fall short. You help without being asked. You give because you care, not because you expect something in return. But quietly, slowly, something changes. The appreciation fades. The effort becomes expected. And the more you give, the less anyone seems to notice you're giving at all. It's not the act of sacrifice that breaks you. It's the silence that follows it. The lack of acknowledgement. The assumption that you'll always say yes. That you'll carry what isn't yours because you always have. Resentment doesn't show up overnight. It builds in layers. Through every dinner you paid for without thanks, every favor you did without rest, every time you absorbed someone else's frustration just to keep the peace. You tell yourself it's kindness, but it starts to feel like punishment. You begin to notice that your effort isn't building a connection. It's a breeding expectation. And the more reliable you are, the more invisible you become. That's when resentment takes root. Not in anger, not in conflict, but in quiet. A silence filled with all the things you never said, all the needs you never voiced, all the exhaustion you swallowed because you thought being selfless made you strong. There was a man I knew, a high school teacher, beloved by students and overburdened by the system. He took on extra classes, mentored kids after hours, stayed late to help with events, fundraisers, and crisis meetings. He was the man they all depended on. But not once in 10 years was he formally thanked. Not once was he promoted. When he finally asked for a sabbatical, they denied him, saying there was no one else who could cover his workload. He didn't speak much after that. He didn't quit. He just withdrew, smiled less, stopped offering. You could feel the weight he carried, not in what he said, but in what he stopped doing. He had given everything and been slowly emptied by it. That's the danger of sacrifice without boundaries. You become so reliable that people stop asking if you're okay. They stop thinking you need anything at all. And you, in turn, stop knowing how to ask. You mistake the lack of conflict for harmony. You convince yourself that doing more is the only way to stay useful. But usefulness is not the same as value. And value doesn't come from what you tolerate. It comes from what you protect. The Stoics taught that you cannot give what you do not own. If you give your time, your peace, your energy without limit, you're not offering service, you're bleeding identity. Service becomes submission when it lacks clarity, and submission without purpose always ends in resentment. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire, but he never lost sight of his center. He gave what was necessary, but he never gave himself away. His journals are filled with reminders to act with reason, to stay aligned with nature, to choose purpose over approval. Because once you begin serving without purpose, you start vanishing without notice. Ask yourself this: how much of your giving is done from fullness, and how much from fear? Fear of not being needed, fear of being replaced, fear that if you stop overextending, you'll lose the place you've carved for yourself in people's lives. But any space you have to buy with burnout is not a space worth staying in. True connection doesn't come from being everything to everyone. It comes from being fully yourself, clear, rooted, and honest about what you can and cannot give. When you keep showing up without being supported, you create a cycle where your silence becomes complicity. People assume you're fine because you've never told them otherwise. And when the day comes that you finally set a boundary, when you finally say, "I can't, not this time, I'm tired," it catches them off guard. Not because you're wrong, but because they've never seen you do it before. You're breaking a pattern, and that disruption feels selfish to them. Even if it's the first act of self-respect you've taken in years. But don't let their discomfort pull you back into your old pattern. Let it be a reminder of how far out of alignment you had drifted. Resentment is a signal. It means something is off. It means you've been giving from a place that no longer nourishes you. And if you ignore that signal long enough, it will eat you from the inside out. Not in explosions, but in small, daily withdrawals. From your relationships, your joy, your voice. The quiet bitterness of the self-sacrificing man isn't caused by a lack of love. It's caused by a lack of clarity. You don't need to stop giving. You need to start choosing. You need to give with awareness, not obligation. With intention, not guilt. And that begins by checking in with yourself more often than you check in with others. What do I want? What's sustainable for me? What am I allowing out of fear rather than truth? Clarity is the antidote to resentment, not confrontation, not emotional outbursts, just calm, clear boundaries. A simple, "not today" can save you months of silent frustration. A pause before you volunteer can protect your energy from depletion. A private moment of honesty with yourself can realign years of misdirection. Your kindness is not the problem. Your silence is. Your giving is not the danger. Your lack of limits is. If people keep taking without noticing, it's because you taught them they could. But you can unteach it. Not with anger, but with stillness. Not with distance, but with definition. The moment you begin choosing what you give, the resentment begins to dissolve. And in its place grows something much stronger: dignity. And that's a presence the world can feel, even when you say nothing at all. 6. If you're always agreeable, you become replaceable. There's a quiet danger in being too agreeable. It doesn't feel like a problem at first. You're helpful, cooperative, you never challenge. You avoid tension, keep things running smoothly, and make yourself available. You think you're being a team player, a steady presence, the kind of person people can count on. And for a while, they do count on you. Not for your vision, not for your clarity, but for your compliance. Until one day, they don't. Because when someone who always agrees stops standing out, they start to blend in. And when you blend in long enough, you disappear. People don't notice you because you don't ask to be noticed. You don't draw lines. You don't create edges. You mold yourself around everyone else's expectations, hoping that comfort will lead to connection, that flexibility will earn you favor. But a connection without contrast is fragile. An agreement without opinion is hollow. When your presence never challenges, never corrects, never stands for something distinct, it becomes interchangeable. And anything interchangeable is by definition replaceable. Respect requires contrast. It grows in the presence of boundaries, in the clarity of someone who doesn't flinch just to be accepted. Stoic strength isn't about resistance for the sake of resistance. It's about firmness. The kind that doesn't need to be loud because it's built on something deeper than approval. A man who is always agreeable is not necessarily kind. He may be afraid to offend, afraid to be misunderstood, afraid to risk discomfort. But that fear, when worn too long, turns into habit. And that habit will silently reshape your identity until you no longer recognize who you are without someone else's expectation guiding your behavior. The world doesn't reward those who blend. It remembers those who define. And definition comes from choice, not constant approval. When you say yes to everything, you dilute your presence. You erase the value of your time. Your agreement becomes expected, not earned. And when people expect your agreement, they stop considering your perspective. You're not consulted, you're assumed. And once you become a man of assumptions, you no longer hold weight in the room. You just fills the pace. Presence is not about being everywhere. It's about being felt when you choose to be. That's what Stoicism trains you to build. A self rooted in clarity, in will, in the ability to say, "This is who I am," without wrapping it in apology. If you never push back, how will people know where you begin? If you never speak your truth, how will they know your mind is even present? If you never say, "I see this differently," how will they ever learn to meet you rather than manage you? In work, in relationships, in friendship, this principle is the same. You don't earn irreplaceability by doing more than everyone else. You earn it by standing for something no one else is willing to. Not stubbornness, not ego, just the truth, yours. You have to be willing to be misunderstood for the right reasons rather than praised for the wrong ones. Because when the moment comes to make decisions, to face a challenge, to lead with conviction, they won't turn to the one who always said yes. They'll look for the one who spoke with weight, who held ground, who made choices, not compromises. That kind of presence doesn't require dominance. It requires stillness. A quiet kind of authority that doesn't beg to be acknowledged but can't be ignored. You gain that authority not by pleasing everyone, but by disappointing the right people, the ones who only liked you when you were easy. Let them flinch, let them push back, let them leave. If your identity depends on never disrupting anyone else's comfort, it was never an identity. It was a role. And roles are easily recast. You're not here to be the background character in someone else's narrative. You're here to take full responsibility for your own. That begins with drawing contrast, by showing that your time isn't open to everyone, that your voice has direction, that your actions aren't just reactions to what others want from you. You weren't born to be the agreeable one. You were trained to be, through 1,000 small moments where conflict felt unsafe, through social cues that rewarded silence, through relationships that praised you for being low maintenance, when what they really meant was easy to overlook. But you can unlearn that, with clarity, with a pause, with the courage to speak in a tone you've silenced for years, not to argue, not to disrupt, but to reveal that there's a mind behind the kindness, a standard behind the calm, a fire behind the stillness. Let that show, even if it's awkward at first, even if you fumble, even if people don't recognize you when you begin, because maybe they weren't seeing you to begin with. They were seeing a version of you that made their lives easier. And now, they'll have to meet the real you. One who doesn't fold to fit. One who doesn't smile through dismissal. One who doesn't exchange himself for access. That man doesn't need to announce his worth. He lives it. He walks into the room differently, not to take space, but to own it. And in a world full of replaceable politeness, that kind of presence becomes unforgettable. 7. The world rewards clarity, not compliance. In a world overwhelmed by noise, compliance fades into the background. It doesn't stand out. It doesn't get remembered. It gets passed over. Because being agreeable is not the same as being anchored, and people can feel the difference. You may think you're gaining favor by nodding along, adapting quickly, and avoiding resistance. But without clarity, your compliance just reads as an absence. If you don't show where you stand, people assume you'll stand wherever they place you. You've seen this happen. You've watched someone with less skill, less depth, less experience walk into a room and make an impression, not because they had more to offer, but because they presented themselves without hesitation. They spoke simply, clearly, and directly. They didn't beg. They didn't over-explain. They stated their boundaries and worth, and the room adjusted. Meanwhile, you thoughtful, prepared, and capable remained quiet, not out of ignorance, but out of caution, out of habit, out of a lifetime of trying not to take up too much space. And when it was time to choose, they didn't choose you. Not because you weren't good enough, but because you weren't clear enough. That's the cost of compliance. You're seen but not felt, liked but not valued, present but not impactful. And it happens because you've been taught to smooth yourself out, to avoid friction, to let others lead, to show humility by showing less of yourself. But humility isn't hiding, and stoicism isn't silent. It's stillness, yes, but stillness with weight, with shape, with a presence that says, without raising its voice, I know who I am, and I know what I will and will not accept. The Stoic doesn't speak to please, he speaks with purpose. And when that purpose is clear, people listen, even if they don't like it. That's what clarity earns you. It doesn't make you the most popular. It makes it impossible to ignore, because clarity cuts through confusion. It stops the cycle of being overlooked, second-guessed, or bypassed. It sets a tone. And the man who can set a tone doesn't chase recognition. He shapes it. You don't need to talk anymore. You need to speak with weight. That means less softening, fewer disclaimers, fewer qualifying statements that shrink your truth before you even express it. It means saying no when you mean no, and not dressing it up in apology. It means expressing what you believe, even when it won't be met with applause. Because your job is not to be palatable, it's to be grounded. And grounded people don't disappear when challenged. They hold their line, not for ego, for alignment. If you're always agreeable, the world assumes you have no position. If you're always flexible, they assume you have no form. And when decisions are made, people don't choose those without form. They choose those with shape. Those who can be relied on to bring definition, to bring clarity, to bring structure to chaos. And that structure only comes from someone who has first defined themselves. Ask yourself, how often do you speak your mind only after everyone else has spoken? How often do you wait to see what others feel before revealing how you actually feel? How many of your decisions are shaped not by what's right for you, but by what's least uncomfortable for the room? If your voice is always a response, never a signal. You've been trained to comply, not to lead. But this can change. Not by becoming loud, not by seeking attention, but by owning your space. By learning to let silence do the work when needed. By using fewer words, but choosing them with more intent. By being so consistent in who you are that people begin to trust your presence before you even speak. This isn't about performance, it's about precision. Clarity is built through repetition, through the daily choice to say what matters, through the discipline of not softening your truths for easier digestion, through the courage to let others misunderstand you, if that's the cost of staying in alignment. And alignment always costs something: comfort, approval, ease. But what it gives you is worth far more. Dignity, focus, a sense of quiet confidence that doesn't need to be validated to exist. Stoic masculinity doesn't chase influence, it builds the foundation. It doesn't mold itself to be accepted, it refines itself to be unshakable. And when the storms come, because they will, the compliant man gets moved. The clear man remains. Because he was never there to be liked, he was there to be true. You've spent years making yourself agreeable, and it's gotten you access, but not presence. Inclusion, but not influence. It's time to shift. To begin replacing politeness with purpose. To speak when silence costs you clarity. To act when inaction is just a form of quiet self-betrayal. Let your boundaries speak louder than your willingness. Let your decisions reflect your values, not just your habits. You don't need to explain yourself to be understood. You need to be clear enough to be seen. And once you are, the world will have no choice but to meet you where you stand, or step aside. Either way, you'll know you stood for something real, something you didn't compromise to survive, something they can never replace. 8. Your voice matters more than your approval rating. When your whole life is built on being accepted, silence becomes your shield. You say what's expected. You laugh at what you don't find funny. You agree when you want to object. Not because it's right, but because it feels safer. And slowly your voice stops sounding like you. It becomes a version of what others want to hear. Polished, predictable, pleasant, but not honest, not whole, not anchored in who you really are. You don't lose your voice all at once. You lose it in small choices, in meetings where you hold back, in relationships where you pretend, in moments when you had something real to say and didn't. Approval can be addictive. The smile, the nod, the feeling of being accepted by the group. But the more you chase approval, the more you shrink. Because you can't keep everyone happy and keep your integrity at the same time. One has to give, and too often, it's you. But what if you stopped asking, will they like me, and started asking, will I still respect myself after this? That shift changes everything. You stop reacting. You start responding, not to the room, but to your values, to your reason, to the truth that lives underneath the urge to blend in. And when that truth rises, it won't always be met with applause. Some people won't like you, some will misunderstand, some will walk away. But they'll be walking away from a man who finally decided to show up fully, not the version they trained him to be. The world doesn't need more agreeable voices. It needs honest ones. People who speak with precision, people who aren't afraid of discomfort, people who know that truth, even when unwelcome, create clarity. And clarity is the beginning of every meaningful relationship, in work, in family, in life. But you won't find that clarity by being soft where you need to be sharp. You won't find respect by playing small in rooms that demand presence. Stoicism never promised comfort. It promised alignment. Living according to nature, according to reason, according to what's right, not what's popular. And there's nothing natural about twisting yourself for the sake of approval. You were not made to echo others. You were made to express something real, something lived, something earned. But you can't express it if your first instinct is to filter, to soften, to dilute your thoughts so they don't disturb the peace. Sometimes your voice is the disturbance that needs to happen, not to create chaos, but to restore balance. Because when everyone nods and no one speaks up, nothing shifts. The silent tension builds, the resentment festers, and under the surface, everyone feels what no one is willing to say, until one person finally does, and the room exhales. That person isn't always liked, but they are felt, and feeling, not favor, is what leaves a mark. Your voice was never meant to be background noise. It was meant to carry weight. But weight requires courage. It requires letting go of the need to be constantly understood, letting go of the fear that you'll offend someone by telling the truth, letting go of the habit of smoothing over your convictions just to stay agreeable. Approval fades. Respect remains. And the people who matter most won't need you to shrink, they'll need you to stand. Ask yourself, when was the last time you said exactly what you meant, with no filter, no self-edit, no apology? Not with aggression, but with calm, steady truth. That moment, however rare, is where your power lives. You don't have to shout, you just have to mean it. People listen differently when a man speaks with presence, when he speaks from values, not from fear, from alignment, not from performance. And no, not everyone will like it. That's not the goal, because being liked is often about staying harmless. Being respected is about becoming clear. When you make your approval rating more important than your authenticity, you become replaceable. Because what they like isn't you. It's the version of you that never disagrees. The version that never sets a standard. The version that bends quietly and disappears politely. But when you let go of that need, when you realize your voice matters more than their approval, something shifts. You become harder to ignore. Not because you're loud, but because you're true. And in a world filled with noise, truth is rare. People may not always agree with it, but they remember it. They adjust around it. They respect it. Because even if they don't like what you said, they know exactly who said it. That's what Stoic strength looks like. Not domination, not performance, but clarity that doesn't ask for permission. A presence that doesn't chase approval because it already stands in truth. And the man who lives this way doesn't seek to be validated, he seeks to be aligned. And that alignment creates a ripple far stronger than any applause. Your voice matters, not because it's perfect, but because it's real. Because it comes from the part of you that refuses to perform. The part that's done disappearing, the part that finally understands, being liked is temporary. But living in truth, even when it costs you comfort, will outlast all of it. Let them misunderstand you. Let them feel uncomfortable, but never again let your voice die inside your throat. Speak, stand, exist. Fully. True strength isn't found in being agreeable. It's found in being aligned. Every time you say yes when you mean no, every time you silence yourself to keep the peace, you lose a piece of your presence. But today, you've been reminded that your clarity holds more weight than compliance. Your voice matters, not because it pleases everyone, but because it reveals your truth. And truth, spoken calmly and consistently, is what separates a man who is tolerated from one who is respected. As you leave this video, take these teachings as more than ideas. Take them as daily practice. Start small. Say no once where you used to fold. Speak once where you used to stay silent. Not for conflict, but for self-respect. Because self-respect is not given. It is built, one honest word, one firm choice, one clear boundary at a time. This is the heart of Stoic practice. Strength without aggression, presence without performance, dignity without noise. If this message spoke to you, I invite you to share your story in the comments below. You may be surprised how many others are quietly walking the same path, and how powerful it is when one voice stands firm.